Hey. Sounds like this is working. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming on this beautiful day. I am very pleased to introduce John Bates today. I've known John very well since he started working here at the Field Museum in '95. Those of you who have been around for a while probably know that John periodically just kind of disappears and shows up again several weeks later. We often hear, oh yeah, I was, doing some field work somewhere. He's rather self-effacing about these things. So I want to try to fill in a few of the gaps here for you today, just to give you a sense of what he's been up to. So John got his bachelor's and master's from the University of Arizona, PhD from Louisiana State University, did a postdoc at the American Museum for a couple of years just before coming here in 1995. In addition to serving as curator of birds, John has served as the chair of the zoology department for 9 years, head of the life sciences section for 6 years, head of the Pritzker Lab for 2 years, project leader of an Albertine Rift project for 11 years. He has served as a lecturer at Makerere University in Uganda for, 22 years, where he has served on PhD committees. He has appointments at the University of Chicago in the Committee on Evolutionary Biology and University of Illinois at Chicago since he started here. He has done extensive teaching. I'm not going to go through the list. Countries all over Latin America and Africa. He has chaired committees for 19 PhD students. He's been on 30 PhD committees in the US and other countries. Reviewer for over 52 journals, over 150 publications. He's received 25 grants, major grants. Much of John's work has focused on birds, systematics, evolution, phylogeny, biogeography, the kinds of things that have to do with biodiversity studies. Those have led him to become quite interested more broadly in issues having to do with collections, collection-based resources and research, and how those things need to be dealt with currently under our often very challenging circumstances. That has led him to serve as president of the Natural Sciences Collections Alliance for 3 years. He has gotten quite interested in how museums in general, and in particular how the Field Museum, can engage with the problems that we're trying to deal with globally today. So with that, I am going to turn it over to John and let him speak about the roles of collections, data, and biodiversity into the future. John.
Thanks, Larry, and thanks everybody for coming. Matt, thanks for finding a position for me. And it turns out it was in an actually really interesting time given the schedule of what's going on, both inside the museum and in the world. This is a little bit of an unusual ARMOR seminar, but I hope it'll be interesting for you all. And it's going to start, with specimens and the extended specimen, which is actually a concept that comes out of ornithology. There was in 2017, there was a edited volume by Mike Webster at Cornell University with a bunch of chapters talking about how avian specimens could be used, and it was titled The Extended Specimen. And that's been incorporated into a broader scale set of things that I'm going to be focusing on today. So I put this in quotations because maybe this talk is organized, maybe it's not. it's an introduction into various national pieces and entities. Then I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about advocating for collections and biodiversity research at the national level. And then I'm going to finish up with a specific example of sorts where there are challenges and opportunities, and that's related to the bioeconomy, which is a hot topic these days in some areas. And as Larry said, I mean, for me, I got into this as a kid borrowing specimens when I was about 8 years old from the University of Arizona collection in plastic tubes and taking them to show and tell. And so I've cared about collections for a long time. And over the course of my career, it's been a real honor to be associated with a whole bunch of different natural history collections and get to know them and get to know the specimens in them and how they can be used. But again, I want to emphasize that this talk is about biodiversity of all kinds and how we can get across the value of that to the public at large. Now, every time I give a tour of this building, one of the first things out of my mouth is that I will tell the visitors, you are standing in one of the greatest natural history museums in the world. And maybe that goes without saying, but I don't think it does. And so I always like emphasizing this. And at the same time, I really love small museums. So here's the Jarika Suchi Museum in Lisle, Illinois at Benedictine University. You may never have heard of it. It's actually a spectacular chock full of old mounts and things. And, you know, there's even a whole whale skeleton, you know, and there are institutions across the country that are like this. And all of these have their role in helping shape who we are with respect to biodiversity research and collections. And over time, in the last 8 or 9 years, I've had the opportunity to get associated with a couple of groups that are involved in advocating at the national level. So one of them is I've been a member of the AOS Checklist Collections Committee for probably about 12 years or so, which is the American Ornithological Society. So we deal with various issues that we try to get the leadership of the American Ornithologist Society to take on. I've also been, as Larry said, president of the Natural Science Collections Alliance, and I continue on as past president, and I'll talk a little bit about that group. And then I recently joined the board of the American Institute for Biological Sciences, again, largely as a representative of the Field Museum. And so one of the things I wanted to do in this talk was let you know that that's what I do. And if you have things you want to talk about that you think should be brought up to the national level, please come talk to me. So this is one of the things that I think is fascinating about our community. And it's a slide that was put together by Deb Paul, who's a very good bioinformatics person, currently at the Prairie Institute at the University of Illinois, University of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois Champaign-Urbana. And she would use this for as an introduction to groups down in Florida for the Thematic Collections Network grants that were coming out of NSF. And what you can see is that it's an incredible amalgamation of logos for all these different groups. And I think it highlights two things. One, I think it highlights how intimidating it is for people to get their minds around the kinds of stuff we do. And at the same time, I think it highlights how much we're doing and how far we've come in a lot of different ways associated with our collections and digitizing them. And this is going to be a theme throughout this talk. And so I can still to this day look at this figure and sit there and go, do I really know what Pensoft does? And so I just love the fact that it makes me, you know, when she showed it to me, I went up and said, you know, can I borrow that? Because I really think it's an interesting way to illustrate the complexity of what we do. You've got various data portals out there like iDigBio. One of the things I'm always bothered with is we use acronyms all the time, which I think sometimes confuses the issue more than anything else. GBIF is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, in case people don't know. How many went to Joe Miller's seminar last week? Good, a few of you did, some of you did. So Joe Miller is the director of the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And that's actually an international data portal for all biodiversity data. But what you may not know is that GBIF is actually funded by governments. And the biggest government supporting the GBIF is the US government through the National Science Foundation to the tune of $600,000 a year. And so, again, all this stuff is tied together in lots of different ways. So the Natural Science Collections Alliance was formerly the Association for Systematic Collections, has been around for about 30 years. And what it is it's a group that goes around and asks for money from from museums of all sizes. And that money goes to paying an incredible executive director's salary in Washington, D.C. for a woman whose name is Jyotsna Pandey right now. And the goal of that group is there's a board from representatives from museums from all over the country. And we get together on a regular basis and we try to argue for things related to what collections need at the national level. And in addition, there's training exercises. So Jyotsna happens to also be associated with the American Institute of Biological Sciences, which is, again, this is a group that represents scientific organizations. So like the American Ornithologist Union, Evolution Society, Ecological Society of America. And I think that's a really valuable place for the Natural Science Collections Alliance to be associated with, because it ties us together with the broader community in ways I think that can be important for arguing for certain things and for interacting with NSF. Both these entities regularly put out reports on what's going on in Washington related to the kinds of things that we're most interested in. And so they do a lot of things like that. They're also involved in collaborations such as the Nagoya aspects of things like the Nagoya protocols that come up. I'm not going to talk about that today, but we've done some interesting things, particularly associated with digital sequence information. And we also host a variety of meetings. And one of the most recent ones was this past summer, we hosted a meeting here that was jointly it was funded by iDigBio, associated with talking about the idea of a national center for collections data. And that's something I'm going to be talking about through the course of this talk. So in case you haven't heard of the extended specimen, the vision of this is this recognition that we have all these digital data out there associated with our specimens, and that's growing. And we can put that into an extended specimen network so that we can bring all these collections data through various data portals together and make more accessible to people. So that makes our collections more used. It should highlight to funders out there why all these specimens are so valuable. And in addition to putting out this report, we put out an article in Bioscience where we had some conceptual figures about what this looks like. And one of the big differences I wanted to mention was on that Deb Paul slide is there's actually a group called DISCO, which is the European version of the Society for Preservation of Natural History Collections, but they're really interested in digital data. And we've been collaborating with them at the international level through this group called the Biodiversity Collections Network, which is another group of like-minded people that have gotten together to keep funding various projects related to getting training people associated with biodiversity data, but just again, working with groups like the Natural Science Collections Alliance and the American Institute for Biological Sciences to lobby effectively in Washington for the kinds of things that we think we need. And, I just wanted to point out with this expended specimen model, you've got the specimen here at the bottom. A physical specimen from our perspective is the most important thing. And then there are all these tertiary levels that come out of this that go on and on. And, I think these are an incredible model for the way we should think about our collections and our specimens. And I pulled together a couple examples here. So the bird on the top is a wattle gisana, and it's an FMNH specimen. And it was CT scanned and put up on a data portal called Morphosource through an NSF grant called OVER that we just finished up. And the bird was collected in 1973. So here's a specimen that's been in our collection for all those years. And now it's up online in a way that it can be looked at in 3 dimensionals based on modern scanning capabilities. And then down at the bottom is a kingfisher, and the scientific name is Todiramphus chloris. And the entire genome of that is available via GenBank. And it was collected in 1992 by Dave Willard in the Philippines. And what I want to point out there is, we've got these great tissue collections. We've collected tissues in lots of different ways. When Shannon Hackett and Chad Eliason were working on this project that they have related to kingfisher evolution and wanted to do a genome, the first thing we thought about is what's the best preserved tissue that we have? And it turns out back in the 90s, we were taking liquid nitrogen to the field, storing everything on liquid nitrogen. We were taking big chunks of tissue. Those were brought back. They were kept at cryogenic storage temperatures once they got to the museum. And so they were the perfect kinds of tissues for these techniques that we weren't even thinking about back in 1992. And so we've got a whole genome for that that's now accessible to anybody who wants to download it. So one of the things I want to emphasize with all of this is that you'd like to think you can just snap your fingers and people will grab onto a concept. And of course, that doesn't happen. And so from the Extended Specimen Network, I like to point out this timeline. So that report came out in 2019. But if you go back, it actually dates really to a 2010 Biodiversity Collections Network report called the NIBA report, which suggested that we ought to be digitizing our collections. And in 2011, NSF funded what's called the ADBC program, or the Advancing Digitization of Biodiversity Collections program, which funded many, many different grants through iDigBio, and that allowed for digitization of lots and lots of different collections. We still have a long ways to go, but that basically set the course for all this. And I think it's just important to recognize that these things don't happen overnight. They take a lot of time and a lot of effort talking to NSF and getting them to do things. And then for me, one of the best things, and this is a picture from the Oak Springs workshop that we had in 2017 in preparation for writing that extended specimen report, you get to meet some amazing people doing all kinds of different work across the community. And that's been one of the most interesting things to me is how much fun it is to interact with those folks. And it's important to remember that in addition to digitizing specimens, Joe Miller was talking about this, there's a big effort out there to make sure that we find the collections and make the collections findable over time. And digitizing things has brought in lots of small collections into this field. And again, I think the hope is that this will help recognize these collections in ways that get them used and make them relevant into the future, such that there are positions at those places where people are actively collecting still. The other thing we've done is in our community, which I think is really important, and we kind of take it for granted, is we've come up with a lot of standards with respect to how these databases are evolved. So one example is the Darwin Core, which is a set of fields that have been agreed upon through a bunch of discussions with the Bioinformatics and Collections Committee. There are other cores out there. There's the Audiovisual Core, which used to be called the Audubon Core. And then Joe was talking about the Latimer Core, which is specifically designed for fields related to finding collections through data portals. And one of the things I want to point out here is that the authors on the paper describing the Latimer Core include three people whose names everybody here may know: Sharon Grant, Janine Jones, and Kate Webbing from the museum. And so, our participation on these things is actually out there in ways that sometimes I don't think people have a good idea about. Another aspect of all this is that our communities have gotten involved in these ideas about open data and management and stewardship that way. And so this is a concept that's out there called FAIR, another acronym, but findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. And this is a way to, again, think about how we're building these data connections. And currently, the Biodiversity Collections Network has a small meeting grant from the National Science Foundation to put together a couple of workshops centered around themes that we're interested in, like One Health research and bioinformatics, and pulling together members from our community with potentially members from outside our community in order to discuss where we can take all these types of initiatives down the road. And so it's called BioFair, and there's a link there to where you can find more information about that if you get interested. So since I was involved with the Natural Science Collections Alliance, it's been an interesting, I don't know how you call it, period of time with respect to what's going on in Congress and trying to get funding for things. And this is a title of an article from 2020 in Science, where there was a potential bill out there that would have given NSF $100 billion increase and have it move into technology. Now, that didn't make it, but in 2022, the Chips and Science Act actually did get passed. And in the Chips and Science Act, there's a mandate for a big increase to NSF's funding. So if you look down here at the lower right-hand corner there, you can see that NSF's 2023 budget is $9.87 billion. And the Chips and Science Act would actually raise that to $16 billion, which is a significant increase, which would allow them to do lots of different things. The one problem is Congress hasn't actually allocated the money for that. The bill was passed in 2022. So, again, it's easy to forget that all this stuff does take time. One of the things I always point out, and I'll bring this up again in a second, is that NIH funding is $46.1 billion a year, which is kind of amazing that all the rest of science in the country gets only about $9 billion from my perspective. So now I'm going to switch gears entirely and talk about this topic of the bioeconomy, because I think it's an interesting one with respect to biodiversity. So if you go online, the narrow vision of the bioeconomy is that it's all about how humans use resources, use biodiversity, basically. And that, in a linear fashion, we just basically use it and end up polluting the planet. And people have realized that that's a bad thing. And so they've come up with this idea that we need to create a more circular bioeconomy, which in somehow allows us to basically recycle things in such a way that we're not really affecting the planet all that much. Then on the far right-hand side is another version of conceptualizing the bioeconomy, which sort of emphasizes all the things the bioeconomy can be used for to help humans out. And so when I looked at this, the one thing that I thought was, where's biodiversity in all this? And so I started talking to people that I was associated with some of these groups, and my students can tell you that I talk about it there every once in a while. And what you start realizing is that the biodiversity research and collections community, we don't tend to do a very good job, I think, of promoting ourselves, or we could do a better job. So for instance, here's a topic, climate change. And there was a paper published in 2018 by Robert Brulé. And the pie diagram makes up the millions of dollars that are spent lobbying about climate change in Washington. And what you'll see is that most of these things are various aspects of industry, with the only ones that are even close to biodiversity being agriculture and forestry or environmental organizations. And that's great, but where is the biodiversity research community in all this? Well, they're probably buried somewhere in a very small slice in the other category. But my point is that I think we can do a better job of speaking out for ourselves. And then you get to the global economy question. And for those of you who don't know the World Economic Forum, they just met in Davos. And I got interested in them, and I went to one of their website one day, and there was a website, this was probably in 2020, as I was prepping for a talk, and there was this thing called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And it's this incredible, it uses a format called Prezi, where you can go up and down through these various circles looking at relationships of things. And I looked at the World Economic Forum thing, and you can see that in this fourth industrial revolution, which is the starting point for all this, you can see the kinds of things that are important for the environment, or important, sorry, for the world. And, you know, again, global health, COVID-19, data science, behavioral sciences. I don't know, are behavioral sciences more important than biodiversity? I think, you know, it's worth talking about those things. So if you drill down a little bit into this, you do get to biodiversity. And you can see the kinds of things that, according to the World Economic Forum are important with respect to biodiversity. And it has aspects of water, forests, the Arctic, the ocean, global health, climate change. So that's pretty good. You know, you'd like to think that these economic leaders are thinking about that. And then you can get to the country level in some places. And if you call up the United States, this is the only thing that appears that's remotely close to biodiversity in the United States, according to this document, Global Health. Well, it turns out that for this most recent set of meetings in 2024 in Davos, they redid some of this. And so I pulled up the figure that now is up there for biodiversity, which is now nature and biodiversity. And, you know, you can see that, uh-oh, what happened there? Good. Is that better? Ah, Amanda, help. So where I'm going with this is that again, biodiversity is there and there's a lot of good stuff. And that's an opening at some level, at the international level, for us to get more input, provide more input regarding biodiversity, I think, at this level. And again, you get to the United States and it's evolved a little bit too. The one thing that's been added to this big wheel associated with all this industrial stuff is climate change. Well, good. So let's continue to talk to those people at the international level. And at the same time, I think if you look around in the United States, you can kind of see why the United States has this, is conceptually viewed this way or views itself this way. And that's because with respect to biodiversity, I would argue that our federal government isn't really well organized with respect to biodiversity. So we've got all these different departments that deal with aspects of biodiversity. But the first group, the Department of Agriculture, the Forest Service, the National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, are largely management organizations. That's not to say that they don't do good science, because they do. But then you get further down, and again, you know, the US Geological Survey is an interesting thing. One of the first things I did as president of the Natural Science Collections Alliance was join then Executive Director Rob Gropp on a phone call to the head of the ecology section at USGS, because they had just gone through funding cuts and they had cut 100-year-old positions at the Smithsonian Institution related to the biodiversity, the biological survey unit. And so multiple curators and collection managers that had been funded lines in the USGS for 100 years disappeared in a very quick period of time and are not coming back as far as we can tell. So I would argue that there's some problems with respect to biodiversity at this level. You've got the Centers of Disease Control, which of course was made for human diseases, but as the result of what's happened with respect to West Nile, COVID, all these situations where we now know diseases are crossing over from the wild community have suddenly become more engaged in biodiversity research than they ever thought they would. Then you've got the Smithsonian, which is an interesting institution because I feel like the Smithsonian continues to become more and more private as time goes on, based on issues with respect to getting federal funding. And then you've got the National Science Foundation, which is obviously the most important entity for us in terms of biodiversity research. And so we have to continue to emphasize that the National Science Foundation needs to care about this stuff. And then I put in the National Institutes of Health here because I wanted to emphasize to people that in some ways, for biodiversity, the National Institutes of Health has been the single most important entity in the last 25, 30 years. And the reason for that is they handle all the genetic data for biodiversity in the country. And if you think about it, I like to say the reason they do that is only because humans and model organisms have DNA. But that's a good thing. And so, again, you know, the partnerships, and the other thing about that is that that's a stable entity. That's permanently funded. There's never been an issue with the Natural Institutes of Health supporting GenBank and its development. All right, so here's this, again, this idea to supersize things and, you know, where does what we do fit in? And one of the things I would say is that the $16 billion for the National Science Foundation in fiscal year 2025 is something that NSCA, for instance, is submitting letters on, or has already submitted letters on this year to try to get Congress to actually allocate the money for that increase. So those things just have to continue to happen. And of course, you know, this can be kind of demoralizing, but I'd like to point out to people that biodiversity research and collections have always been underappreciated. One of my favorite quotes is this quote from Darwin's father to his son in the 1830s, where he says, "You care for nothing but shooting dogs and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and your family." You know, it's a challenge. Fast forward, and the older people in the audience will remember something called the Golden Fleece Awards, which were actually created by a Democratic senator from Wisconsin named William Proxmire. And he started focusing on government waste. And here's an example from the National Science Foundation, where he's upset about $84,000 being spent to find out why people fall in love. But that's not really what caught my eye in all this, because down at the bottom, he finds some other just egregious examples of spending, which include $15,000 to study hitchhiking, $81,000 to study the behavior of the Alaskan brown bear, $25,000 to study primate teeth, $112,000 to examine the African climate during the last ice age. And, you know, I'd say that's a fairly prescient NSF grant from my perspective. But Proxmire didn't see it that way. And so, you know, this is always going on. If you haven't heard of this event, you should go look it up. It's from 2010, and I remember seeing this on the news one night. And Anthony Cognato is a curator of insects at the Michigan State University, and he'd gotten a $187,000 NSF grant. We call them CSBR now, to buy new cabinets and drawers for the insect collection at the entomology collection at Michigan State. And he got a call from Fox News. And the next thing he knows, he was being interviewed by Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson. And they were using this as an example of absolutely wasted government spending. And so this was back in 2010. And Cognato pointed out that, you know, where do you think the money goes to pay for these cases? It goes to US companies. And I was talking about the bioeconomy to people at some point, and I thought about this, and I said, well, let's take a publication of mine. You know, here's a publication that I'm part of with a bunch of colleagues looking at the the phylogenetics of these jacamars in the Amazon basin. And wow, you know, where does the money go for that? What does it look like? And, you know, I think you can see here that there's a lot of money that's out there that's being spent on these projects, and it's all going into the economy. So I think the concept that this is government, you know, this is waste, is actually not really defensible when you look at it in detail. So you've got curators, you've got graduate students, you've got lab materials, which are bought from US companies for the most part, extraction kits, companies in the US like Rapid Genomics doing sequencing. We're paying for nitrogen, we're paying for liquid nitrogen dewars. We've got collection staff, we've got NSF itself is a bunch of positions funded to provide these grants to people. We've got all kinds of computer programs. So every single aspect of the science we do is actually part of the US economy. And as far as I can tell, it's never really been quantified in any rigorous way. So I wanted to go on with another vignette. And this is one that was interesting and near and dear to my heart only because I knew one of the people. And the title of the article is "The Value of Wild Animals Carbon Surfaces to Fill the Biodiversity Financing Gap." And the lead author is a guy named Fabio Berzaghi, who actually learned GIS in the bird division a number of years ago, went on and got his PhD in Italy and worked on elephants for his PhD. And he hooked up with an economist who at the time was working at the World Bank named Ralph Chami. And Chami had been on a whaling trip in the Gulf of Mexico. And I heard this because I actually was riding in the car one day and the TED Hour on NPR was on. And there was Ralph Chami talking about how he suddenly realized that he could take scientific data that scientists had put together and estimate the value in carbon services of an individual whale. And it came out to be about $2 million a whale, which is kind of neat, right? My problem was they put this article out there and I looked at it and I don't know if anybody's spotted the thing that really bothered me, but I'm going to go into it now. And that is that science is up above the biodiversity financing line on this figure. So in other words, who pays for that science? It's actually not, it just kind of comes into the equation here to help out everything else going on in terms of conservation in the world. And again, I'm trying to emphasize that there's a real value to science. And so I looked at this and I've been talking to Fabio about this and trying to reach out to Ralph Chami, who's now basically left the World Bank and is going out in the world talking about this. But what I would say is, I actually think this model looks better drawn this way. And that is that science is actually something that we need to fund in order to more effectively do on the ground conservation like this. And that's just, that's not just in the US, but that's also in all these countries where all this biodiversity occurs. And, I tried to list some of the benefits up there, which obviously this is I'm probably talking to the converted for the most part in terms of what would be out there in terms of benefits from the scientific perspective associated with preserving that biodiversity down the road. So anyways, even when people are well-meaning, sometimes they can slip up, and I think from my perspective, it causes problems with respect to how they're thinking about some of this. Well, flash forward to December 2023, and I think this was the thing that actually made me contact Matt to give this talk. The Interagency Working Group for the Bioeconomy put out this report on the bioeconomy. And in that report, based on this interagency committee, were some great lines with respect to who we are and what we do. So I've highlighted this, but museums and universities and other institutions across the nation hold large collections of biological samples. Through significant strides, those significant strides have been made. Many of these collections remain undigitized and unknown to research outside of academia. Imaging and digitization of these collections using appropriate metadata standards and inclusion of specimen data and incorporating tribal guidance and perspectives when appropriate would give scientists all over the country access to these data. Well, these are the kinds of nuggets that just don't come every day, especially out of the Office of Science and Technology and the president. And so how do you organize to take advantage of this opportunity? Well, one of the first things you think about is maybe NSF. And sure enough, in January of this year, I got an email that was announcing an NSF initiative, and they had an open house to talk about it called Casa Bio, which stands for catalyzing access to sectors, catalyzing access sectors to advance the bioeconomy. And you go to this and what happens? You hear them talk about the narrow bioeconomy. So I highlighted federal funding agencies there. Department of Interior isn't even included. So Department of Energy, Department of Defense, all these people are being consulted, but there's no aspect of biodiversity in this. Well, you have the option to ask questions in the chat. So one of the questions I put in there is, how does NSF feel like this will work with respect to promoting biodiversity? And I would say the answer was underwhelming. But one of the responses was, well, we're looking for comments from stakeholders. Well, we have an opportunity now to talk to NSF about this, and we should. And these are the kinds of things that I think we just need to be thinking about with respect to this. So that brings me around to this notion of an action center for collections data, and why do we need it? And to me, one of the easiest answers is to just show this figure again, because we're doing a lot of good stuff, and there's a lot of good stuff out there. And organizing it, for instance, along the lines of that crazy World Economic Forum thing I showed you, might not be such a bad thing. And I think, we're at a good time for this. I also wanted to point out, and the lettering is too small for me to even read this on my, God, this is crazy. All right. So right here is Environmental Data Science Innovation and Inclusion Lab, ISIL. And you may not have ever heard of this, and that's because it only started about a year ago. And it's a brand new NSF-funded lab out in Denver or Boulder. And its goal is to work with open environmental data. And it's 10 years of funding, millions of dollars to do that. Well, this is the same kind of thing we're thinking about with respect to the Action Center, with the caveat being that I really do think an Action Center like this needs to be permanent. And so what a permanent National Action Center could achieve both nationally and internationally is along the lines of the things I've been talking about. It can raise the status of biodiversity and biodiversity research at the federal level. It can train a bigger workforce and more diverse and well-paid. And that's obviously a critical thing with respect to moving things forward broadly. I think there can be a coordination network of networks, and that's got to be a two-way street. That's both between and within institutions, in my opinion. So I'm really fascinated that the Big 13 museums met here a week ago. Let's have a conversation about what they're thinking about in terms of what's important to them. And let's, my feeling about giving this talk was, if you have questions that are boiling up in your mind associated with this, let's get them on the table as an institution and think about how we can potentially address them. So again, I think a National Center for Collections could do a lot of this. And to finish up, what are the kinds of things that individuals, institutions, and scientific societies can do? Well, we can convince ourselves, for the most part, one of the first things I would say is we can convince ourselves that our institutions are a significant part of the bioeconomy and the national economy. And I think if we do that, then our relevance actually, we can argue for it more effectively. And that's going to require going to legislators and the public. And this, again, this isn't something that everybody would want to get involved in, but it's definitely something that we need to do. And that's why groups like NSCA or AIBS are really valuable. I've learned over the last couple of years that the value of outside partners is actually going to be essential with this. I use the example of NIH and GenBank as one perfect example of that in a lot of ways. So could we find economists out there? Well, I'm not sure about that. So that's unlikely. But there are lots of university programs that we could get into associated with bioinformatics to train the next generation. Inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility is essential to broaden the number of people coming into this pipeline. And we may have to think about how we can interact more effectively with applied fields and their societies. And then finally, digital data initiatives are happening. I was telling Lance Grandy just before this talk started that the National Academy of Sciences just published a full report on something called the digital twin. And all the digital twin is, in my opinion, is the extended specimen for humans. And if we can't figure out ways to partner with that in the same way that, for instance, GenBank is funded by NIH, I think, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. So I'm going to finish up with just this set of sentences I started putting together, where I started with it's about biodiversity, but I finished with it's about biodiversity, biodiversity data, and research, and the workforce necessary to collect, archive, network specimens and their data into the future. And, I think that's a fairly good way to think about things from my perspective, associated with how these groups are trying to move things forward. And that picture at the top, in case you're wondering, is part of biodiversity. Humans are part of biodiversity. Those students finished up a visit to the Field Museum. They're actually 27 years old now, and I know that because the guy with his arms crossed looking serious is my son. And, I just want to emphasize that one of the reasons why we all do this is for the future generations. And there are going to be lots of future generations, I hope. So I'm going to stop there and answer any questions you have. Thanks for coming.
I think we have significant time for questions.
So this is really interesting, and it strikes me that what still seems to be lacking is there are so many small efforts from so many different directions and so many sources. Do we have an effective way of consolidating these things to the point where we're not duplicating efforts and we're building more universal strength in this area?
So this is my own personal opinion on this. I mean, at some level, NSF is sort of involved in doing that with respect to how they decide what gets funded. But again, they do that through a reviewer's pool and in a way that can actually fund the same things. And again, at some level, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, the more different ways we do things, we may come up with better solutions. So one of the reasons why I think a national center could help the collections and research community with respect to this is that kind of coordination. And sometimes people don't even know what's going on in another part of the country. And obviously, with the web these days, you can get stuff up on the web and get it accessible, or you can use X and talk about it that way. But at the same time, I think, that coordination is something that groups like NSCA just, we're big enough to advocate, but literally not big enough to maybe effectively coordinate. And that's one of the reasons why I think this action center would be so important.
One follow-up thing I'd say too, specifically with digitization. I mean, I see how vitally important it is for our efforts in that area, but that's certainly not going to negate the importance of having the actual specimens, because of the, what's going on these days with enhancement of imagery and other things. I mean, what sort of safeguards do we have in place for that kind of thing?
I mean, part of me would say I'd like to worry about that when we truly get the amount of, we begin to even scratch the surface of what's out there with respect to what we could learn from scanning stuff. I mean, it's interesting, right? So you bring that up, and I will tell you, one of the things that struck me from the National Academy of Sciences report on the digital twin stuff was that it actually was not very many people from the medical community. It was almost all people from from informatics and bioinformatics. And what I mean by that is they were thinking more about cybersecurity and things like that because of patient records and stuff. But those are the kinds of things we can learn from those folks if we actually effectively partner with them. And so, again, I continue to think that a lot of this is just kind of reaching out at all different levels. So even at the local levels of these, programmers have good ideas about how to better archive data, to better set up collection standards. I mean, there's all kinds of things like this. We don't really have an effective format to allow those people to necessarily get stuff out there in ways that get picked up by others. And I think we need to be thinking about how to do that. And I think that, that's a big conversation because I'm always amazed by how little I know about the bioinformatics world in that sense.
First of all, great talk. That was very succinct. It was very well spoken. I think it's like one of my favorite talks so far. So first question, it's gonna be very easy. Could you go back to the bioeconomy slide?
Which what?
The one with the little, with the recycling thing, the circle.
Sorry.
I know a lot of circles, sorry. The one where you compare what's going on now to 2040.
Oh, so I think I know which one you mean.
Yeah, that one. Thank you.
Yep.
And so my other questions are more like in depth than that. Will using social media help promote collections awareness? Like,
Sorry.
Like using TikTok or YouTube, you go to promote the collections to people to further this whole, like to further awareness of it?
Well, what I would say is one of the great things about an institution like the Field Museum is we've got access to lots of different talents across the institution. And so, we have our YouTube channel that's got a lot of really interesting stuff on it. Yeah, I mean, somebody could come up with a plan to do more stuff. I think those are the kinds of conversations that we ought to have as collectively.
Okay, so final question, I like this. If we did want to like alert our congressman, or actually, who should we alert for one thing? Can you make a prompt for that? Like, this issue matters, biodiversity matters to me, what can you do about it?
So yeah, and as a matter of fact, one of the things that I meant to put in the slides and didn't is that NSCA and AIBS both have programs where they specifically encourage people to contact their senators and potentially go talk to them. And then they'll provide the training leading up to that to talk about how you might want to approach that. So again, one of the really neat services that those two organizations provide is that kind of training. Bruno, Matt, and I, and somebody else, was Leslie part of that too? We talked to Mike Quigley, Representative Mike Quigley recently. And for those of you who don't know, Mike Quigley is a US representative from the suburbs. He's literally one of my favorite people in politics right now. And one of the reasons for it is he came around specifically asking for us to talk about issues along these lines. And he went to a bunch of different institutions across the city in doing so. He's also responsible for one of my favorite pieces of legislation, which is that he's submitted several times a piece of legislation to get botany officially represented in the federal lexicon, because it's not there. And you think about that, when I first heard this, I was like, that's so quaint. But if you step back and think about what botany is relative to the US Department of Agriculture, it suddenly becomes less quaint, and you kind of want it to be in the federal lexicon. And we knew his chief of staff, or we talked to his chief of staff a number of times about things. And the chief of staff was, I think, one of the driving forces for that. And he just said, you just have to keep submitting these things. And again, so I hope botany will become part of the federal lexicon at some point.
So which two had the prompts again?
What's that?
Which two organizations?
So the American Institute of Biological Sciences, AIBS,
Okay.
and the Natural Science Collections Alliance. And again, I want to emphasize to everyone that I do this, in my opinion, representing the Field Museum. And so if there's anything that comes up from your perspective about things that you'd like to see us think about associated with scientific societies or associated with going to the federal government, please let me know. I'm happy to help orient you on some of that.
Very much.
So John, you showed how in the like concept and the development of how where bioeconomy, the concept of bioeconomy and what we're gonna do about it at a national or international level. Starting to realize that it has something to do with biodiversity, but up until now, it wasn't an important concept there. But this summer, I also learned something the past summer, something interesting at the uh, meeting, at the consortium meeting for the International Barcode of Life initiative, that even in when we're talking about biodiversity, say like in international agreements, we have goals for preservation of biodiversity. We don't have any metrics. So like biodiversity is actually the only thing that we have goals, we need to preserve that much. There's absolutely no document that says how we're gonna evaluate whether we're successful or not, which is different, say, from carbon or other things. In those forums in which you are involved and have this discussion come up of how collections or how the kind of research that we do could provide the basis for not only like inserting biodiversity in bioeconomy, but also where, like for biodiversity properly, like starting to take more seriously in terms of metrics and knowing where we're going?
Great question. And I would say that it's more along the lines of trying to do a more effective job of collecting research that actually goes in that direction such that we can talk about it. And I would say a lot of people start despairing at that point because they never feel like there are enough publications out there that truly get at this. And I actually think that that's not entirely true. I just think it's, again, they have different foci and different geographic levels and things. And so harnessing all that together is really hard. And, of course, there are these groups out there that are assessing population sizes of vertebrates and things, but maybe not insects and much, all of biodiversity. But, I think collections play a major role with respect to what I always call monitoring through time. And that's because, you can count things and that's great. And certainly, one of the neat things that's being incorporated into to places like GBIF are citizen science databases. Well, that means that eBird, for instance, is the largest single contributor to data at GBIF, billions and billions of bird observations. And one of the neat things is those bird observations have numbers with them. So in some senses, if you're worried just about numbers, that's going to be great. But what about the underpinning of what's going on as numbers change? Why are things declining? You may know something's declining. There's papers out there that have documented the number of birds in the US has dropped 3 billion in terms of numbers of individuals based on the estimates over the last 40 years. But when you start looking at that, you're talking about 600 species, and every single one of those species has probably got completely different aspects of what's driving its population increase or decline. And so, we need more and better data. One of the things I think, coming back to stuff you and I've talked about, is I think it highlights the value of museum collections from thinking about data in the broader sense too. I mean, we can archive different types of data that, because we're good at handling data and making it available to people. And so, I think you guys are doing this stuff with the eDNA right now. That's not necessarily going to be specimen based, it's going to be sample based. But it's going to provide a lot of information that may be really useful that is not likely to come from other places. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I may not have answered your question very well, but again, I think this is a bigger conversation and we definitely should have it.
John, I've got a comment and a question for you myself. So the comment is that actually, in terms of beginning the process of digitizing collections, The Field Museum was one of the first to engage in that kind of thing. So I know that by about 1980, the mammal and I think the bird collections were in the process of being digitized. The only collections that I know of anywhere, there may have been some, that were earlier than that were at the Smithsonian, and that was in about beginning in maybe 1975. So there's a long, long history of this kind of work being done here. And the museum has held a very influential role, often unrecognized, but because we have so often been very early in the process, people have come to us for advice on how to get started on this process. And that's had an important impact. The question, and you're not going to have time to answer this, I know, but okay, you've talked about the US. All of this is extremely important. How do we extend it to countries globally?
By reaching out to people, I mean, we have lots of connections in countries all over the world. We always have. And I think, we need to, one of the things I've always advocated for is everywhere I go, I'm interested in what kind of natural history museum there is in the places I go to. And, I've always been admired people like Gary Feynman over the years, who's started his anthropology museum in Oaxaca, and Ryan Williams, working with museums in Peru. And I think that we can always do better with respect to interacting with local natural history institutions. I mean, one of my primary mantras associated with international conservation efforts is they don't necessarily focus enough on building the capacity for local science. And local natural history museums are a natural hub for learning about biodiversity. So I would say that's one of the simplest things. And then, of course, at the broader level, I brought up that World Economic Forum stuff in part because, we live in a world that's pretty well connected globally. And so there's lots more we need to do at the highest levels to get biodiversity more broadly appreciated by leadership everywhere.
Okay, well, thank you, John. Thanks very much.
Thanks for coming.